Welcome to Rule 63, where we like to talk about the intersections of science, politics, and media, specifically as they relate to the transgender experience. This month, we're talking about transgender athletes, a subject that has come up a lot in the news lately. If you're interested in sports in any capacity, you've probably seen headlines about trans women smashing records previously set by cisgender women, and you may have a lot of questions about trans people in sports, especially women's sports. The media coverage about trans people, if we're ever discussed at all, usually begins and ends with how much we're disrupting the spaces that we enter. Then everyone starts duking it out in the comment section, and things get messy fast. The average person just doesn't know a lot about what it means to be trans, especially what it means to medically transition. And while I'm going to be covering a little bit about the biology of hormones as they relate to athletics in this episode, what I'm really interested in is the stories we tell about trans athletes, and how athletes in general are treated in the modern sports industry. What can we learn about what it means to be trans by looking at the way they're discussed in sports media? Are the ways in which trans people are discussed connected to other media narratives about marginalized people? And just how political is the sports world really? But there's just one problem. I'm a huge nerd. My high school sport was first robotics competition, and my usual approach to talking about sports is waiting patiently for the conversation to change to any other subject. I've only gotten into certain sports like the WNBA in the past couple of years, so while I'm intimately familiar with narratives about transphobia, I needed a little help understanding the norms of the sports realm and how athletes are reported upon. Which is why I've brought on my friend Demi for this episode.
The problems that we have is visibility and representation. If we don't see people that look like us in certain spaces, we feel almost as if we have to, hide parts of ourselves because we don't want that part taken away.
Demi Alexander-Nicholas is a sports journalist and graduating senior from the University of Connecticut. They're also a transgender woman from Jamaica and a former track athlete. They've been following sports ever since they were little, and their unique experience as a queer Black person was really enlightening on this subject. Together, we talked about their time as an athlete, their incredible transition story, the racism and misogyny in modern sports, what needs to change in how trans people get reported on in sports media, and how they're trying to change those narratives in their own writing.
You can never separate sports from politics.
Yeah.
End of story.
End of story.
Yeah.
What I found in my conversations with Demi is that not only are the negative narratives around trans athletes nothing new, but they're impossible to disconnect from other forms of oppression. I invite you to join me in learning about how sports can be an exploitative industry, how bodies are racialized, gendered, and policed, and what all this has to do with trans people. My name is Anna Marie, PhD. Welcome to Rule 63. This episode has content notices for misogyny, racism, and transphobia. Before we get into talking about transgender issues specifically, I think it's illustrative to talk about how cisgender men and cisgender women are treated differently in sports media. It would be an understatement to say that sports is an incredibly gendered field. When you watch men play football, you get to see macho stereotypes play out in real time. What you also get to see, or rather hear or read, is the commentary, usually from two dudes in a box far away from the action, or a sports writer giving their notes after the fact. The first thing Demi brought up when we sat down to talk about gender in sports was the disparity in how male athletes and female athletes get talked about. Reporting on men's games, it's very detailed. And
very detailed, down to the second, literally down to the play. But women is basically, a summary of what happened. She did this, she did that. No standout, nothing. Even if somebody had a really good play or a good move or a good race, though they didn't win, it wasn't mentioned. But if it was a guy that we're talking about, it was very, very different.
This is a problem across the sports industry. Even if fans love women's sports, they're taken less seriously by the media and the sports leagues running the show behind the scenes. Demi told me about how they first saw this disparity as a high school athlete back in Jamaica.
For example, there were an all-male school who compete there. They have the bigger support because they dominate every year. And of course, rightfully. They've earned the bragging rights. My school has won 30-something years, the most in history of the championships. But when it came to the women's sports, there were other schools who were dominating like in streaks every single year. They weren't given the same amount of reverence or respect. And that is my first understanding that, women are talked about differently, they're represented differently, and they're valued differently when it comes to sports.
It is a well-documented problem that female athletes get paid less than their male counterparts, even when they're bringing in more viewership. And media narratives are incredibly powerful here. Male athletes become the makers of American culture. Everybody knows the names of LeBron James or Michael Jordan, but professional women's basketball just doesn't get the same reverence. When women's sports are treated as frivolous by those working in sports media, when women's sports coverage isn't getting the same number of clicks as other sports coverage, that manifests in negative attitudes towards women's sports more broadly, and importantly, less capital flowing into women's sports in terms of investors, which leads to women getting paid less. Which is also where we run into the problem of racism in sports. The YouTuber FD Signifier recently made an amazing video essay on black male athletes and the mechanism by which they're brought into sports as a means of class mobility, only to be exploited by a racist industry that doesn't actually care about their well-being. A well-trained anti-racist eye can see this as clear as day just by watching a game of men's professional basketball or football. Black bodies performing on a field, colliding their bodies in such a way that may leave them permanently damaged for the benefits of fans around the country, but mainly for the benefit of their white coaches, white team owners, and rich white investors and the corporations who sponsor the games. With little to no support in the form of financial literacy or medical care after the athletes retire from being on the court. If you follow the money and look at the racial and gender demographics of who makes up the sports industry, from the players to the media class to the people in power, there's no way around the fact that people of color are getting exploited in the industry. Which is what makes the calls for black athletes to, quote, shut up and dribble or keep politics out of sports so infuriating. This is something Demi notices a lot in sports media. One example she gave was of the disparity in how black athletes and white athletes are discussed in conservative spaces.
That also has more to do with race in sport and politics in sport than anything else.
As just one example, Fox News host Laura Ingram's double standard in sports commentary was called out in June 2020 after she defended white NFL player Drew Brees, who disapproved of the growing trend of athletes kneeling for the national anthem to protest American racism. This was in stark contrast to her treatment of black athletes like LeBron James, who she criticized relentlessly for their activism.
Laura Ingraham said, quote unquote, he should just shut up and dribble the ball. And she laughed about it. Shut up and dribble the ball. You have no space in this conversation. You're not qualified to speak about this. This is the best man in the NBA, the richest man in the NBA, the highest paid man in the NBA, who's also black. And here comes a white journalist telling him, oh, he should just shut up and dribble the ball. But when Drew Brees expressed his political opinions, she defended him. And Drew Brees is white. She defended him as saying, oh, he's entitled to his opinion. He's allowed his political opinion. And, that just goes to show how black athletes are viewed versus how white athletes are viewed. So black athletes should not speak up because they're just little puppets and toys who should just shut up and dribble or shut up and hit the ball. Whereas Drew Brees is a white NFL player. Yeah, he's entitled to his opinion. So black athletes aren't. So we think about the racism that does exist in sports and, media and politics. Yeah, it's just a lot that I could unpack.
Criticisms of athletes who deviate from what's expected of them to shut up and dribble are always leveraged harder against athletes of color than their white teammates. This phenomenon isn't limited to extremely conservative correspondents either. There's also the example of Rachel Nichols, a white female correspondent for ESPN. Nichols was fired from her job in August 2021 after a leaked discussion where she made two controversial comments. A, that her colleague Maria Taylor only got her ESPN job because she's black, and B, quote, I'm exhausted. Between Me Too and Black Lives Matter, I got nothing left, unquote. Essentially, Nichols expressed frustration about the growing movement from fans and athletes to not ignore the very real political movements going on within her field. And mind you, as a female reporter, it's very likely that she herself experienced untold amounts of sexism behind the scenes. But her privilege as a white woman allows her to dismiss these things, and make comments about how she just wants to get back to business as usual.
And as someone who has built her effing career on the backs of black athletes, to turn around and say between Black Lives Matter and Me Too she's tired, that goes to show you they don't care. She literally builds her backs on the careers of black athletes. The NBA, I can't tell the percentage because I don't have it factually, but I know for a fact, without even knowing the actual numbers, there are more black players in the NBA than there are white players. And that's what substantiates my claim that she's built her career on the backs of black athletes, yet still she still turns around and says Black Lives Matters too much, and her black colleague got the reporting job only because of diversity and inclusion. Yeah.
As we can see, the way sports media figures treat athletes, both in their reporting and behind closed doors, is emblematic of a bigger problem of exploitation, racism, and misogyny in the sports world. This also brings us to the title of this episode. The term misogynoir was coined by Moya Bailey, a black queer feminist scholar, to describe how racism and patriarchy combine to form the unique experience of women of color in American popular culture. Black women, for example, have to deal with a myriad of issues that are not faced by black men or white women. Not to get too theory-heavy on this show, but Patricia Hill Collins is useful here. Collins outlined 4 controlling images of black women, 4 archetypes that they are forced into by society's perception of them. There's the asexual mammy, the hyper-masculinized and domineering matriarch or angry black woman, the state-dependent and hyper-fertile welfare queen, or the hypersexual Jezebel or Sapphire. If you've seen a negative depiction of literally any black woman in any part of society, it probably falls into one of these tropes. These stereotypes don't come out of thin air, but rather as a means to control black women through policy and interpersonal discrimination. As Hazel Carby reminds us, quote, "The objective of stereotypes is not to reflect or represent reality, but to function as a disguise or mystification of objective social relations." You can see these racialized gender stereotypes play out all the time in how people talk about black female athletes, who are in the tough position of having to perform feats of strength and athletic ability, a task usually associated with masculinity. Black women in sports are often characterized as mannish, hypermasculine, and angry just for sticking up for themselves. I'll let Demi tell you about how Serena Williams, the world-famous tennis player, is treated in sports media.
How she's been masculinized by not just the media, but just the black community also. And how she's always, if she expresses herself on the court, like if she challenges a call, she's angry. If she speaks up for herself, she's angry. Mind you, Serena Williams she's had outbursts on the court. And I'm all for it. Express yourself. Speak up, woman. I'm all for it. Black women have been silenced for far too long. And I feel like with the platform she has, she set the example and she set the precedent that for black women who look up to her that, hey, speak up for yourself. It doesn't matter if you feel being cheated, if you feel being cheated or treated unfairly, speak up. They took that as anger.
As opposed to men who are
smashing rackets, like using curse words, like hitting balls away and hitting like umpires. The reporting is very different. Serena is also operating with the backdrop that she has not been treated fairly in her own country as a black woman for years. And when she's finally able to speak up for herself, it's she's angry.
If you pay attention, Serena Williams has faced undue amounts of criticism compared to her white male peers.
And one of the things that she said in her so-called meltdown, quote unquote, in the 2018 US Open final was that she said to the tournament director, like, I know you can't admit it. And that meant, to me, that was so profound because politically he can't say, oh, it's because you're black. She said to him, I know you cannot admit it. And she had tears in her eyes. So I think about moments like that. It wasn't anger. It was just frustration with just finally being able to speak for herself. Whereas Roger Federer, who's the so-called, with his contrived image, which is why I'm not a fan, everyone thinks he's this soft, very gentle, and he sells it really, really well. The tears, the family man, when really and truly Roger Federer is one of the biggest divas on the tour. Believe it or not. But of course, he's a white Swiss man, very top of the sport. They will not report on him when he has his... I literally heard him say to a chair umpire, I talk when I want to talk. Literally. And because the chair umpire was saying, okay, you can stop talking now. He's like, I talk when I want to talk.
Wow. The drama.
The drama, right? But people were like, oh, Federer's speaking up. But like, they were celebrating him for saying
Celebrating for speaking up.
Then Serena,
oh my God.
Here we go, the spoiled, entitled, black, angry woman. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So of course, she's treated differently because she's a woman, also because of the color of her skin.
And when black women aren't hyper-masculinized, they're hyper-sexualized, which has also happened to Serena Williams.
You know, think about Serena wearing, like, for example, another common example. She wore a catsuit at the French Open in 2019, I believe, when she came back from pregnancy. I want to say it was 2019, yeah. And they banned it. They're like, she can't wear that. It's a catsuit. She like it's a full black bodysuit with a red centerpiece, like a belt. And they're telling her, it's too much. You can't wear that. Imagine that. If it was anybody else, it would have gone over, but because it's Serena, like, she has been policed. It is, in astronomical numbers, like, it is crazy how much she's been policed.
There's also an example that we see all the time, both in sports and in general, about how black women's hair is policed.
This is the same Serena Williams who, for years, her and Venus boycotted, Indian Wells, which is a tennis tournament, because they were booed, literally, in 2002 or 2000, I believe. Venus Williams she wore beads, and you know how beads are like a black stereotype and how people feel about them. She wore beads on the court, and I remember there was an incident of an umpire saying her beads are flying, so he's going to penalize her for her beads flying. You think about things like that.
These are just a few of the many examples in which black women are over-policed in the world of sports. To summarize everything we've learned so far, if you want to understand misogyny in America, you can look at how women's sports are treated as frivolous or lesser than compared to men's sports. If you want to understand racism in America, you can look at how black athletes are treated. Black men are paid to perform hegemonic masculinity for the amusement of white audiences, and black women are, additionally, masculinized and denigrated at every turn, with policies being enforced harder on them than any other group. So, if you want to understand transphobia in America, you need look no further than how trans people are discussed in sports media. In fact, Moya Bailey's term misogynoir was later developed with writer and photographer Trudy into Transmisogynoir to further illustrate the intersecting impact of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation on black trans women and femmes. So when we come back from our ad break, we're finally going to get into what you probably came here for, the trans stuff. Rule 63 is brought to you in part by listeners like you. If you like what you're hearing and want to hear even more sweet, sweet content from me, Anna Marie, and my co-producer Danny, you can just give us a couple dollars a month to get access to loads of bonus content. Included in that content is the full uncut interview with every guest we've had on the show, including the interview with Demi. Dem and I talked about their whole incredible story growing up gay in Jamaica, how they came into the US, and how they forged their femme identity in the male-dominated sports world. You do not want to miss this one. It is probably my favorite interview I've done so far. Danny and I also do extended bonus commentary for every new episode that drops, and monthly live streams where you get to discuss your thoughts on this month's topic with us. If that all sounds fun to you, or if you just want to support the show out of the goodness of your own heart, head on over to patreon.com/rule63. That's patreon.com/RULE63. The link is in the show notes. Anyway, back to the show. So, the predominant negative narrative about trans women in sports is that, using their superior man strength, they are coming into women's sports so as to dominate and reap the benefits that are supposed to be given to a protected class. Regardless of what individual people actually believe about trans women, whether they affirm that trans women are women but are just concerned about fairness, or whether they think that trans women are men who are intentionally nefarious, both groups are serving the dominant narrative about transgender women, that they're men or man adjacent and shouldn't be taking up space specifically meant for women. But how true is it that trans women have a biological advantage over cis women? let's take a step back and talk about biology. Not because I want to, but because apparently I have to. Most sports are separated into men's and women's leagues, and this is for understandable reasons. Testosterone, a chemical I've taken exhaustive steps to remove from my own body, is generally produced in higher quantities in the bodies of people who are equipped with testes and were likely to have been assigned male at birth, and is generally produced in lower quantities in the bodies of people who are equipped with a uterus, who were likely to have been assigned female at birth. People who were assigned female at birth, who overwhelmingly but not always go on to identify as women, don't actually have zero testosterone kicking around in their body. Their ovaries, adrenal glands, fat cells, and skin cells produce the chemical anywhere from 1/10 to 1/20th of the rate of those who are assigned male at birth, who overwhelmingly but not always go on to identify as men. Testosterone is overwhelmingly agreed upon to have a major determining factor in athletic performance. Before puberty, i.e. before the introduction of testosterone in those equipped with testes and estrogen in those with uteruses, there is no sex difference in circulating testosterone concentrations and also no difference in athletic performance between the sexes. However, after puberty, a reproducible dose-response relationship between circulating testosterone and muscle mass manifests in an 8 to 12% strength and endurance advantage in those with bodies that contain an amount of testosterone within the statistical average of cisgender men. The averages change depending on the study, but one widely accepted metric is that the average circulating testosterone concentration is 7.7 to 29.4 nanomoles per liter for cisgender men and 0.0 to 1.7 nanomoles per liter for healthy premenopausal cisgender women. As such, the recommended cutoff for eligibility in women's athletics has been proposed as having less than 5.0 nanomoles per liter circulating testosterone in your bloodstream. But remember, these are the 95% reference ranges from a sample size that is necessarily smaller than the entire human population. They don't fully reflect the wide variety of the human experience, including men with non-functioning testes, women with mild hyperandrogenism stemming from polycystic ovary syndrome, who are actually overrepresented in elite athletics, or those born with certain intersex characteristics in which their bodies produce vastly lower or vastly higher quantities of testosterone than the statistical average for their perceived sex. Sex, after all, is a context-dependent summary of a multidimensional variable space. No one physical trait, such as the parts you have dangling from your body, secondary sex characteristics, karyotype, gamete production, or even circulating testosterone concentrations, can single-handedly determine your biological destiny, never mind your socially constructed gender identity. And with regards to how testosterone levels are measured, the instantaneous level of testosterone you can collect from just one blood sample can fluctuate by as much as 19% over the course of a single day, and several factors other than biological sex, such as height, weight, and general endocrine health, can affect your personal testosterone levels as well. This is the actual biological reality of sex as it pertains to sports, and sources for everything I just said are in the show notes if you want to take your own look. Now, take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, unclench your jaw, take the tongue off the roof of your mouth, and ask yourself, do you expect the average cisgender sports journalist to be able to articulate all of this, much less repeat it in every single article published on the subject of trans people in sports? What you've probably heard is some version of testosterone makes you stronger and men have more of it. We can't engage each other in this conversation if we can't even get the facts straight. I was reluctant to include that 3-minute description of biology because, in reality, most people don't know and don't care to know about the biochemistry of sex and gender. What I've found is that people's willingness to engage in the subject of trans people in sports is more so dictated by their beliefs about gender metaphysics and broader trans politics. So, instead of biology, let's talk about some illustrative examples of how trans people get talked about in the media. What about transgender athletes and how they get reported on as opposed to cisgender athletes, in your experience?
What I've observed through my lens as a trans person and also as a journalist, there's always a certain tone or undertone of transphobia. It's almost like, let me provoke the readers, the court of public opinion with this.
Leah Thomas is a member of the UPenn women's swim team who has been in the news a lot in the past few weeks. Leah is a transgender woman who has abided by every standard set out by the NCAA, or National Collegiate Athletic Association, regarding trans athletes. She went on feminizing hormone replacement therapy for more than 2.5 years. The NCAA only requires 1 year. ensured that she was in the normal range of testosterone for cisgender women, and demonstrated that her strength and speed have gone down since swimming for the men's team just a few years prior. This is in accordance with our current scientific understanding that once testosterone has been removed from your body and has been gone for a sufficiently long time, your athletic performance goes down with it. It's hard to articulate just how violently hateful some of the reporting on Leah has been. Just by Googling her name, you could see a tabloid-level obsession with dead-naming her and calling her a man, but that's not the most important part. Transphobes are going to transphobe. What's interesting is that even the more supportive headlines can still serve transphobic narratives. The Washington Post recently talked about Leah in a positive light, using the headline, "A transgender college swimmer is shattering records, sparking a debate over fairness." To the average onlooker, this seems supportive. They are highlighting Leah's achievements in the sport of swimming. Good job, Leah. But consider the fact that Leah only broke 2 records, the 200-yard freestyle and 500-yard freestyle, and only by a matter of seconds. Consider the narrative of trans swimmer shatters records, and who that narrative serves.
The Washington Post posted a story that, she's shattering records. When you think about that, I mean, she's breaking records, yes. But when you think about that, it's to add to the narrative that there's an unequal playing ground or unlevel playing field when it comes to trans women in sports. It's nothing but that.
I do think that overall, the WAPO article does a good job of outlining Leah's story, at least compared to the drivel I've seen in other outlets. But the description of shattering or obliterating records is an alarmist take meant to get rage clicks.
In the direction in which journalism has gone the past couple of years, say 10 years, I can understand. And, the need for wanting the engagement, wanting the likes, wanting the feedback, having to compete with so many. When it comes to trans people, which is a hot topic, they know it's going to spark the debate. It's controversial press. So whatever they're reporting, whether good or bad, there's always an undertone of transphobia in it. Because they won't report on the fact that there are trans people who sometimes get beaten at sports.
Yeah, they're only going to selectively highlight the one that's beating everyone else and not the dozens that aren't.
Are getting beaten. So that to me is just to add to the narrative.
News outlets are never going to report on the trans athletes who are getting second place, third place, or completely losing, because that's not a story that serves the dominant narrative around trans people. The journalists reporting on these issues need to remember the larger transphobic narratives at play so that they don't fall into them. Because it's these stories, these headlines, that get used as fodder in the online hate machine against trans people.
People do see the news hold the news to a certain authoritative standard. So if the news says this is what is happening. So as to the greater narrative that trans people will always have an unfair advantage. Because once they see trans shattering, that's all they need to see.
Yeah.
And they go off in a think piece. They only need to see 2 words, transgender woman shattering records, and they're gone. So yeah.
It's kind of funny that this story of a transgender swimmer supposedly having an innate biological advantage over their peers is coming up, because a common refutation to the idea that trans people shouldn't be allowed to compete in sports, at least in the trans community, involves another swimmer, Michael Phelps. If you weren't aware, Michael Phelps has a body that was seemingly engineered for the swimming pool. He has a long torso and a wingspan longer than his height. His legs have hyperextended ankle joints and double-jointed elbows, and he even reportedly produces less lactic acid than other athletes, which allows him to get more use out of his muscles without getting sore. Michael Phelps has a biological, even biochemical advantage over his peers, but he's celebrated for it. Meanwhile, Leah Thomas does everything right in cooperating with the NCAA and is relentlessly mocked in the press, only because she's transgender.
She had been swimming for UPenn on the men's team years before, and then she started transitioning. During her transition, she, of course, was reporting to the governing body of the NCAA, which requires you to be on HRT, hormone therapy, for at least 2 years before they allow you to compete. And of course, even then, you're still tested.
Even more ironically, during the production of this episode, Michael Phelps publicly came out against Leah Thomas's participation, saying that the issue is very complicated, and even comparing Leah's advantage to doping, the illegal practice of someone taking performance-enhancing drugs.
So for him to liken trans women competing in sports, that is a very violent comparison to me. It is criminally violent. Like, how can you say trans women competing in sports is like doping? Something that is so frowned upon, something so scorned. You literally get casted out, lose sponsors. And you liken somebody wanting to be themselves but also compete in sports to that? That is transphobia.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can say to convince me. Just when you break down what Phelps is saying, it is transphobia. And Phelps of all persons should not talk.
He's likening being trans to being illegal.
To taking drugs.
To taking drugs and
to be
being
better.
illegal. Yeah.
And that is just a wild comparison to me.
Sometimes it feels like this conversation is too toxic. Trans people want equal treatment and are willing to sacrifice so much time and energy to proving themselves to cisgender women and the world, but our mere existence is too much of a hot-button issue. To many people, trans people are inherently political, and they really just want us to go away, just like how they want their athletes to shut up and dribble. Not to mention the perception that some people are too married to trans ideology to be agreeable and civil. I asked Demi if there's a healthy way to discuss the role biochemistry plays in sports, and they said that they would be open to anyone who genuinely wants to engage with the subject.
It is only worth discussing if people are going to listen with an open mind and understanding how hormone replacement therapy works and how the effects it has on the body long term, and not here's why they shouldn't compete. No, I will never have that conversation about like, oh, I will never try to engage in the debate about the advantage. But if you're open to, if somebody's open to listening, here's how hormone therapy affects the body. Here's how the body changes. Here's how testosterone breaks down. Here's how estrogen levels go up. I'm willing to have that conversation. So yeah, it is worth being discussed on that, in that light, in that frame, as opposed to, oh, here's why they shouldn't compete because I don't engage in discussions like that, but I will openly and be first to say, hey, here's how hormone therapy affects the bodies of transgender female athletes, of course. Yeah,
I mean, a lot of people are having this discussion in bad faith, quickly just being like, oh, testosterone.
To justify their transphobia. No.
To justify
their transphobia. I can't see it as anything else, because if you aren't even considering or even taking the time to research how hormone replacement therapy works, then I don't think you're saying that in good faith to protect women. Whatever you're saying, your reasoning, and I understand it, is rooted in transphobia. You can't convince me otherwise, and I'm not sorry.
There are two other major figures that are brought up in relation to trans people in sports: Renee Richards and Castor Semenya. The contrast in their stories is really illustrative of the ways in which race and class play a role in determining how athletes who don't fit gender norms are treated in broader society. Renee Richards is a white trans woman and anthropologist who fought to participate in the 1976 U.S. Open. Much like Leah Thomas, Renee also did everything she could to qualify for women's tennis, securing hormone replacement therapy and even SRS, ultimately winning a Supreme Court case which ruled that she could compete as a woman. Mind you, this was the 1970s, when access to these medical resources was difficult and expensive, and transphobia was orders of magnitude worse than it is today. Publicly transitioning was unheard of, and to win such a landmark case is incredible. I cannot knock that at all. But Renee Richards' case stands in stark contrast to how women of color are policed, even to this day.
Think about that being in the 1970s on the heels of the women's rights movement as a white woman, right? And what the ruling was. I think about how much if that was a black trans woman who was not as privileged as Renee Richards was, and how different the ruling would have been.
Compare this to Castor Semenya, a black South African runner and two-time Olympic gold medalist. Castor is an intersex woman, and despite having been assigned female at birth and living her life as a woman, she has naturally elevated testosterone levels compared to the average cisgender female. Her story is long and inspiring, but her continued track record in sports is currently still up in the air, ever since a 2019 rule change regarding the classification of female athletes with regards to, you guessed it, testosterone levels. The rule would force her to take medication to suppress her natural testosterone levels, which people are perceiving to give her an unfair advantage. But of course, it's not just about meeting some fairness standard. Accompanied with Castor's victories has been a widespread backlash calling her a man, much like the reporting on Serena Williams, Venus Williams, and countless black women before her. This is a textbook case of misogynoir, and it's not hard to see that the struggles faced by black women and trans women are sometimes one and the same, and that the policing of black trans women's bodies is the most extreme out of any other group. So even though Renee Richards' victory in court was a victory for some trans people, we still have a ways to go as a society.
Because if we're in this century, and 2012, 2013, 14, 15, 16, Castor Semenya, a South African cisgender woman who, if she's being policed for her natural testosterone level, she's black. We can imagine we can only imagine, right, what the ruling would have been had the colors been different.
So it's not just that biochemistry is used to justify transphobia. Biochemistry is used to justify excluding any non-normative bodies, especially those of black women, from competing fairly in society. My point in making this episode is not to claim that trans people should be allowed in women's sports as long as they fall below some biochemical line, whether it's 5 nanomole per liter of testosterone, or 2 nanomole per liter, or 10 nanomole per liter, or even if testosterone levels aren't your metric at all. It's to say that no matter where you draw that line, some transgender and cisgender women will fall outside of it due to biological factors that they can't control, and the result will always be that black and trans women will be policed more. Oh, and also, men's sports barely regulate testosterone levels at all outside of illegal doping. Women, cis and trans, are told to suppress their totally natural levels with medication. But for men, come as you are. If there's one through line to this show, it's that science is a tool of systemic oppression. Straight, thin, cisgender women are held up as the norm by which all women's bodies are compared to, and all bodies are racialized and gendered in such a way that serves white supremacy, systemic racism, and capitalism. And if you think that this has nothing to do with class status, I have one more quick example that may help you understand the scope of the problem. My home state of Connecticut has been a battleground of sorts for trans athletes, thanks to the case of 4 high school girls who sued their school district to keep 2 transgender high school girls from running on their track team. I won't go into the full story, but one of the stated reasons given by the plaintiffs in the case was that the existence of the trans competitors had the potential to deprive them of opportunities for advancement in the sport and college scholarships for track. And I just think it's weird that instead of putting all this effort into, say, advocating for free or affordable college for everyone, a bunch of upper middle class mothers of private school kids got together to wage a petty years-long legal battle to affirm that, no, the system where our daughter's only chance at getting a quality education is to perform feats of strength for an audience is the system we want. We just want to be the beneficiaries of that system. That's what a lot of this is really about. Trans people are a scapegoat. We lack political power and are generally a mystery to those who don't directly associate with us or engage in our struggle, which makes us an easy target to point at and blame for all the unfairness in the world.
When people say trans people should compete in their own leagues, it's literally just reinforcing that idea. The otherness, stay over there, don't come over here. Don't come through the door. Don't come through the door. There's a tweet that I saw on Twitter not more than a month ago. A guy was saying the world became a weirder once we started opening the doors to the T words. And I will not repeat what that is. And while it was very infuriating, I had a reckoning with the idea of how people view transness and trans people. Like the door, once you open the door, once you give them rights, for example, that is when hell starts breaking loose. So imagine that you just want to be yourself and have your rights to life, but somebody's saying don't open the door to them.
The violent hatred of trans women dominates this conversation to such a degree that we can't even talk about other very real problems, such as whether trans men feel safe in locker rooms around cisgender men, and that non-binary people face a unique challenge of not knowing which leagues to compete in at all. And all of this is why you can't separate what trans people face from other forms of oppression. Trans people in sports and how they're reduced to bodies and not people is of the same stuff as general athlete exploitation. Cisgender women are impacted by transmisogyny in unique ways, and all athletes are objectified and mistreated, but in ways that are much worse for women, especially black trans women. At the center of all of this is the media, which has the power to tell trans stories in a positive, affirming light, but often chooses not to. Journalists have a responsibility to get it right, which is why I'm so thrilled that more people like Demi are stepping up and taking on the task of writing about trans people in a way that centers our lived experiences.
For me, if we're gonna, generally when we talk about trans people, there's an undertone, just generally, even if there's no harm, there's an undertone of otherness or theyness or go over theirness and them versus us or that group, or I don't like that because it hurts any kind of progress that we're trying to make. Because if we don't change the narrative in the media, then us as people, we won't get there. So it starts with me, and I won't say the media because I'm a part of the media. It starts with me.
Demi shared with me some of the trans and non-binary athletes who inspired them, from Laisha Clarendon in the WNBA to Quinn, the Canadian soccer player who came out in 2020, and even Leah Thomas, who faces online harassment to this day.
As we make advancements, there are not many trans athletes, and I hope to see more. Now, Leah Thomas, of course, is another who's definitely inspired me. And when I say I get my inspiration from the fact that I don't want to say brave. I hate when people call trans people brave. Oh, be brave, because of course you're doing something that's really bad and it takes bravery to do it. No, I hate that word too. I will not say brave, but I will say the courage it takes to take up space. Not to be trans, no, be yourself. But the courage it takes to take up space in a world that is fighting daily and doing everything in their will and power to keep us back from advancements and advancing, but also doing it at the highest level. You think of a collegiate swimmer at an Ivy League, oh my gosh. That's typically a white cisgender man. But here we have a transgender woman who is that person, and I could not celebrate it more.
I also asked Demi what next steps need to happen in order to have broader acceptance of trans people in sports. And in a teaching moment, they reminded me to reframe my own language.
Now, you use the word accepted.
Oh boy.
You know how I feel about that.
The word accepted.
Because accepted sounds as if our validation or existence depends on whether they, the straights, the Christians, wants to accept us or not. And I want us to get rid of talking like that. I'm not saying, I know you don't mean it in harm. I know.
No, I totally.
But for me, I'm saying you can understand when I say, as somebody who's passionate about the way we talk about things and the way we write things, certain words actually do more damage than they help with advancements. So for me, when somebody says accept, I'm not singling you out or anything. I'm not like angry at you or anything, of course. But I'm saying if somebody says, oh, but I don't accept, or they have to, I hope they accept. No, you're already saying you're less than. Your entire existence and validation depends on whether they accept it or whatever. Their comfort level for them to give you acceptance. That is not a word I use.
It was Pose actor Dominique Jackson who said in a 2019 speech, quote, "You do not have the power to accept or tolerate me. I take that from you. You will respect me." We as trans people need to reaffirm that language has power, and we need to demand to be heard, not ask to be heard.
If somebody's not trans, they can't tell you what is transphobic or not. Because I started feeling bad where, like, you remember I was saying to you, maybe I'm being sensitive, like, it is transphobic. Like, remember I was having that conversation a lot with you? Like, saying, is it them being transphobic? But I'm like, no. In your eyes, you're a trans person. If you see it as transphobic, it is transphobic. Because this is your lived experience that you would have experienced more than once. You know what transphobia looks like. You know what it smells like. You know what it sounds like. So don't let anyone else dictate what transphobia is.
We also need allies to step up and work together with us towards policy change. We're releasing this episode on the first day of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing, for a reason. I'll refer you to my favorite leftist feminist podcast, Season of the Bitch, and their episode on the Olympics. But if you're not already aware, the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, is responsible for the destruction of local environments, seizing of land from indigenous communities, and the increase in militarized police around the world, and so much more. I mean, I was gonna get into the Olympics, but that can be my own tangent. Do you have anything to say in general about...
Fuck the Olympics, abolish it all, burn it all down.
One key example is how the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics required the LAPD to ramp up their resources, which ultimately helped to fuel the eventual war on drugs. And there are very legitimate concerns that the 2028 Olympics, which will also take place in LA, will result in even more police militarization and racist surveillance practices. And I just used 1984 and surveillance in the same sentence, which means it's probably time to end this podcast episode on sports. Sports fans have a responsibility to demand better from the industry, to withhold our support for games or leagues if they continue to promote racist, misogynistic, or transphobic policies, and advocate for better reporting on trans issues. By recognizing how all systems of oppression overlap and finding solidarity with one another, we can envision and create a world where sports is what it's supposed to be. Something fun, something that brings people from around the world together in a celebration of human achievement. And in the immediate term, if you're a sports media company, hire trans people to write about trans people, like Demi.
Yeah, we have a very far way to go. But I do believe, like I said, we've made advancements, and I believe in the future. And I feel like with my reporting too, I have something to add to that, and how we can, even in the smallest way possible, how we can change the narrative around how trans women are seen in sports, how they're reported on, all of that. When I've put my experience in perspective, it wasn't like this. So there are people who have given me the courage and made me feel empowered, like yourself, to be a trans person, someone of trans experience, and also in a space where you would not see people like me. So yeah, we're making advancements in little spaces, but when you really look at the bigger picture, it's adding up. So definitely, I have reason to be optimistic.
Hi, thanks so much for listening to this episode in full. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to us on either Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts. It helps us with the almighty algorithm if you leave us a review and share it with a few people who you think might like it. If you really like what you heard, consider becoming a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/RULE63, where you can get access to bonus content. For each episode we do, Danny and I do a bonus episode where we talk about that month's topic in more detail, and you'll get access to monthly Q&A live streams where you get to talk to us, and it's a really fun time. Also up on Patreon right now is the full uncut interview with Demi. You can hear us discuss their transition story, some nuances of the discussion on how men are stronger than women, our thoughts on the Olympics, and so much more. Here's a preview. You can drop your Venmo too.
Yes.
Venmo and Cashapp.
Give me money.
Give Demi money.
Purse.
We'll literally just drop, like, along in the show notes, we'll drop your Venmo.
Yes, I'm an immigrant. I came from a third world country with a big dream, and I'm doing big things, being big trans, being big journalist. Give me big money. I deserve it. And I'm black.
They do deserve it.
So open your purse.
Open your purse.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know Anna has a really good audience. I've heard really good things about you. Open your purse. Please.
Open your purse,
I'd appreciate
please.
it.
All of Demi's info is in the show notes, so you can follow them, or open your purse, as it were, along with all the references for today's episode. And just as a final note, Demi is on the job market. They're graduating this semester, spring 2022, with their bachelor's in journalism and sports management. So if you're in any position to help them out and hire a black trans woman sports writer, please contact them directly or reach out to the show on social media or at the Rule63podcast@gmail.com. Okay, that's all for now. I will see you next month for another Rule 63 episode. Bye!